In this session, we'll be updating our existing authorization policy rules by creating exception policy. Let's take a look at our existing wired policy set and explain what exception policy provides. Okay, as mentioned, general processing within ISE is handled hierarchically as we see visibly here. We evaluate authentication policy first, which drives us to a particular identity provider, which collects additional attributes, and then we process through authorization. And you'll notice that we've got two areas for exceptions here: local exceptions, which are local to this policy set and will only apply to this policy set, and then global exceptions and rules that we have within global exceptions would apply towards all policy sets, and then we would evaluate our standard authorization policy for this policy set. In this case, again, the hierarchy is there, so exceptions, local exceptions are evaluated ahead of global, which are evaluated ahead of authorization policy. Outside of the hierarchy of the exception rules, they operate identically and they are configured identically to what we would put into a standard authorization rule. Let's go ahead and add a new rule for a global exception, and we'll see that the Condition Studio works just the same, and we would see the same conditions in this list as we would see for any other authorization rule on our ISE deployment here. Selecting one of our domain groups, focus on IT staff for our condition match, and then if we match that particular group name with authentication, then we will authorize for the Cisco built permit access authorization profile. This particular authorization profile is not editable. You can't manage what's in there, but by investigating it, you'll be informed that what's happening is it's providing an access accept via the radius authorization messages that go back towards the NAD for a user session. Let's save this policy, and then let's try testing this out on our access switch, and we'll duplicate a user authentication from the command line. Our domain user and domain password, and process through AAA new model rules on this access switch. And of course we get the quick message back that we're successfully authenticated. Unlike our previous test, we don't have any more specific authorization other than access accept, so we're not seeing any of those details other than the fact that, yeah, we successfully authenticated our IT1 user. Let's investigate this from ISE's perspective. We'll open up operations and radius live logs. Yeah, we should see a new entry in for our IT1 at demo.local account. We can expand out and see what we've matched for authentication and authorization, and then ultimately the authorization profile that's being provided. So some nice summary details right up front. Should point out that because of the tests that we're doing from the switch, that neither 802.1x or MAB are being utilized for this authentication access request, so we're matching the wired default rule and not wired 802.1x or wired MAB. In this case, that's allowing that default authentication rule allows access without interacting with an identity source. It drove that towards all user ID stores and matched to our Active Directory domain and learned that we're part of the IT group and matched this authorization rule within our exception policy. If we look at details, this will divulge more info in terms of the interactions. So ultimately it accessed all user ID stores, went through all AD join points, and finally determined demo.local was what needed to be accessed, and that at the bottom we achieved our radius access accept, and we also see authentication successful here in the detail. Okay, going back to our policy sets, and we can see that we've got one hit process now against our wired policy set, and we can see one rule listed as a global exception, and we have one hit against our new global exception rule. And of course now we're looking at this from within the wired policy set. Let's investigate from the wireless policy set. In this case, we're seeing the global exception, and one rule has been added to that global exception policy, and we see the match counter on that particular rule. So it didn't match the policy set itself because it didn't come through from a wireless NAD as part of evaluating the policy set, but we did get a hit on the individual rule itself. Okay, just a quick tour of exception policy. Again, can be advantageous to create systemic or environmental type exceptions. Could be a temporary exception for something that you're trying to work around, say something with network or some other sort of disruption, and the global exceptions in such that we can get a nice consistent set of authorization policy applied to all policy sets regardless of what else that they're achieving below.